Good day. Today is the 24th of February 2023 and is the 1-year anniversary to the start of the present stage of the Ukrainian conflict. A year ago, on the 24th of February 2022, the Russian army formally entered into Ukraine. Now, there's been an awful lot of discussion and talk about this. I don't personally think it serves much useful purpose to dwell on the events of a year ago, or indeed of what followed. I don't think anniversaries in the state of a conflict, the conflict situation such as the one we're in today, are really very useful, because I don't think it's possible, whilst the conflicts are still underway, whilst the conflict is still underway, to undertake a objective review and analysis, both of the events leading up to the start of the conflict and of the events that immediately followed it. What I'm going to say about the start of the conflict is this. In my opinion, the event that finally precipitated a Russian decision to intervene in Ukraine was the failure of a follow-up meeting of the group that had been set up to implement the Minsk agreement, despite much discussion and many claims that the Ukrainians would finally agree to enter into direct talks with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as they had committed themselves to do by the terms of the Minsk agreement. They refused to do so, and in fact they said that they would not do so under any circumstances whatsoever. Now that convinced the Russians, that finally convinced the Russians that Ukraine would never implement the Minsk agreement, and that, combined with the fact that Ukraine was carrying out an artillery offensive against Donbass and was showing every sign that it was preparing to attack Donbass, that hardened the Russian view that a Ukrainian attack on Donbass was pending, and the Russians had repeatedly made clear that for them this was a red line, that they would not allow the Ukrainian army to enter Donbass and to roll up and occupy the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. So I think this was the event which finally, this combination of these events, was what finally precipitated the Russian decision to intervene when they did. But there's another factor at play as well, which is that I think that a Ukrainian attack on Donbass had been very much in preparation for some time. There was a major build-up of Ukrainian troops along the contact line in the first part of 2021. The Russians countered by their own counter build-up. There was a drawdown of tensions. The President of the United States, President Biden, intervened. He seems to have persuaded both sides at that point that there should not be a conflict, and there was a meeting between Biden and Putin in Geneva. But as has, I think, since become clear, and as the events I've just discussed point to, this was not really an effort to try to resolve the problems in Donbass, to try and prevent a conflict taking place in Donbass. It was rather that the Biden administration was playing for time. They realized that at that time, that is to say in early 2021, there would still be opposition from some members of the European leadership, principally Angela Merkel in Germany, and perhaps other Western leaders of that period, to any attempt to impose sanctions on Russia in response to the anticipated Ukrainian offensive in Ukraine. And I think that was the only reason why the United States put a stop on events in the first half of 2021. I think in the second part of 2021, things then began to change, and I think the decisive event was firstly the fact that Angela Merkel was quitting the scene, and secondly the elections in Germany, which brought to power a new coalition government in which the extremely pro-Ukrainian and intensely anti-Russian Green Party obtained significant posts, with Annalena Baerbock being appointed foreign minister and Robert Habeck becoming vice-chancellor. And I think this was seen in the United States within the Biden administration as opening the way for a conflict in Ukraine, which was anticipated would make possible the kind of across-the-board sanctions that the United States and its allies did duly impose in February 2022, and that the expectation was that those sanctions would crater the Russian economy, lead to huge protests in Russia, bring down President Putin and his government. And thereafter, with the confidence in the United States that Germany would be on side, at least up to a point, there were, I think, some doubts about the reliability of the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. But I think overall the United States, or at least the administration, the Biden administration, calculated that with Merkel out of the way, Germany would not push back significantly against sanctions, would not be able to engage the Russians diplomatically. With all that apparent, I think the United States finally did give Ukraine the green light to launch its much expected, long anticipated, long prepared offensive against Donbass, in the certain knowledge that this would result in a Russian reaction, in a Russian response, that the Russians would see that as Ukraine and the United States crossing the well-established and well-known Russian red lines. Speaking for myself, I had been sceptical for much of the time that a war was indeed pending. I began to change my mind at the time of the Munich Security Conference in February 2022. I was watching this procession of Western leaders, each one seemingly outbidding the other, trying to talk up both the threat and danger from the Russians and the resolve of the West in imposing this economic war on Russia. I found the rhetoric coming out of Munich extremely disturbing. I found the attitudes of the participants in Munich extremely disturbing. And I noticed that Annalena Baerbock, who had recently been on a trip to Moscow, where she had spoken to the Russians in conciliatory terms, the mask with her seemed to drop, and I got the impression that she was actually welcoming the crisis with Russia, that it's clear by this point it was anticipated would come. As for the Russians, I'm going to say something else. In the autumn of 2021, as the crisis deepened, they put forward their two draft treaties. I don't think those were intended exactly as ultimatums, as people say. I don't think that the Russians would have attacked Ukraine or launched their army into Ukraine if there had not been this breakdown in negotiations, if the Ukrainians had agreed to speak to the representatives of the Donetsk and Lugansk republics, and if there had not been every indication that Ukraine was about to attack Donbass. I don't think that that was the intention, but I do think that the Russians hoped that the United States would at least engage with them seriously over the material in the two draft treaties. And I think this was seen by the Russians not so much as an ultimatum, but rather as a last-ditch attempt to try to dissuade the United States from the course that it appeared to have set itself on, leading to a war in Ukraine. Now, I'm going to add to that I've heard reports, which I take very seriously, that far from welcoming war in Ukraine, far from having any anticipation that the war in Ukraine was going to be easy, on the contrary, the mood in the Kremlin in February 2022 was apparently extremely dark. That President Putin and his officials were far from sure how the Russian economy and Russian society would respond to the inevitable crisis that was coming, that there was uncertainty about how to respond to the anticipated Ukrainian attack on Donbass. There were some words, I suspect, of caution, suggesting that even if Ukraine did overrun Donbass, it was in Russia's interest not to respond to that militarily in order to sidestep the sanctions that the Biden administration was planning. But the eventual decision was made that to do such a thing, to allow Ukraine simply to storm Donbass by force, with the almost certain departure, the fleeing of most of the population into Russia, that were such a thing to happen, it would create more political problems in Russia than standing up to Ukraine and risking the sanctions, that the population of Russia would regard that as a humiliation which the Russian government would not survive, and that over and above and beyond that, if Russia did allow its red lines to be crossed in that kind of way, it would be, in effect, the end of Russia as an independent power. So the decision was made, and it was made with great difficulty, and that was why President Putin called all his officials together and went through a public discussion of his Security Council, which was shown on Russian television. That was why, and with a heavy heart, the Russians decided that they had no choice, realistically, but to intervene. In the event, things have turned out otherwise, in the sense that the United States and the Western powers did impose all their enormous sanctions on Russia, but to the astonishment of the Western powers and to the surprise of many people in the Kremlin, the Russian economy withstood the blow, and the Russian people, instead of rising up against the Putin government, rallied to the cause. And I think this has been the single event which has caused all the calculations of every side, both the Western powers and of the Russians, to be thrown off course. I say that because it's quite clear to me, looking back in retrospect, that the original Russian plan was for a military demonstration in Ukraine, which would hopefully bring the Ukrainians to their senses and would lead to a negotiated solution of the crisis. And in other words, that the Russians in February and March were still thinking in terms of a diplomatic resolution of the crisis, as opposed to a military one. And this is why there were those negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians at that time, which led to the apparent breakthrough in the talks in Istanbul at the end of March. Anyway, and in the event, the Western powers, or at least the Britain and the United States, were not willing at that point to moderate their plans. I think they still hoped that somehow, in some way, Russia would break, and they sabotaged the negotiations that took place in Istanbul. The agreement that was almost hammered out there was basically left to fall aside. And the Russians, for their part, realizing that their economy was able to withstand the sanctions blow and that their people were united behind the war, I think that they decided, after some further internal discussion and discussion with their friends, with China, India, and other countries, that the only real solution to this conflict was a military one. And that is, I think, why we have got to the point where we are in today. I think there were miscalculations on both sides in a curious kind of way. The key miscalculation that was made from both sides was the same. I think on the Western side, there was the expectation that Russia would not be able to withstand the sanctions blow that was going to be inflicted upon it. And I think that within Russia itself, there were probably quite a number of people who thought the same thing. And this is what influenced decision-making on both sides of the divide. And I think that it came as a surprise to both sides when it became clear the extent to which they were both wrong, and each side has been adjusting to that failure of that anticipated outcome ever since. Anyway, that's where we are, and I want to say again a point which we've made on the Duran many times, that the real war, the real conflict, began after the failure of the Istanbul agreements at the end of March. It began in April. It has taken the Russians a certain amount of time to adjust their policies to the fact that they are in a war. They've had to discuss and negotiate the fact with their friends, with China and India and all of the other countries. They've had to also prepare their own population for the fact that they're in for a long war. But I think that they have done that, and I think that they are now determined and set to proceed to achieve a military resolution to this war, which I think they now quietly realize is the only outcome possible, the only way of ending this war satisfactorily. As for the Western powers, they've found themselves in a prolonged war in Ukraine that they did not expect, that they have no real plan for, and they've been reduced to a set of increasingly erratic improvisations, trying to find some way to hold things together in Ukraine until perhaps, just possibly, in some way that hasn't happened up to now, Russia finally cracks. So that's my summary. As I said, I don't think it's very useful to go into much more depth than this. I've given you a short summary view of my own opinions. I remain of the view, as I have throughout, that ultimately this war will end with the Russians dictating terms, and that the longer it takes before we reach that point, the weaker the Ukrainian position will be, and that in the process, tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives, overwhelmingly Ukrainian, are being sacrificed in order to achieve objectives and work through a Western policy which has in fact failed. Anyway, let's proceed now to talk about what's actually going on in Ukraine today, and I'm going to focus principally today on the latest Chinese position paper, which is, of course, the latest in a whole series of position papers that the Chinese authorities have published over the last couple of days, the last series of days. Now, before I do that, though, I will do what I do traditionally. I will discuss first the military situation in Ukraine. And here, the big news is from Bakhmut, and we've just received reports over the course of today that Bekhova, another village in the northwest of Bakhmut, has been captured by the forces of the Wagner organization. Bekhova is the latest in a series of towns and villages and small settlements that have been captured as the northern part of the Russian vice pushes down towards the final encirclement of Bakhmut. And we started with Soledar. We then saw the capture of Krasnaya Gora. Following the fall of Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovyevka was captured, and now Bekhova has also been captured. And there are reports that a settlement that follows on from Bekhova, Yagodnoye, is now also largely controlled by the troops of the Wagner organization. There's some reports, there's some reason to think that the entire settlement might have been captured by the Wagner organization, except that there might be some people still holding out there. But official confirmation of that has not yet been provided. Now, can I just say, Ukraine, of course, doesn't admit to any of this. As far as I know, they still claim that they control Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovyevka, and of course they've not admitted to the loss of Bekhova. But I've seen photographs which do seem to have been taken from Bekhova, and they appear to show, in fact they definitely show, Wagner assault troops in full control of the village. So it is, to my mind, indisputable that the village has been captured. Now, there are also reports that the other pincer, the southern pincer, pushing from Opitnoye through Klesheyevka to Ivanivka and near to Chasov Yar, that over the last couple of hours, it too has been reactivated. It's been holding still for some time, but the latest reports suggest that it too has now been reactivated, and that the forces from there are now also pushing forward, certainly into Ivanivka, perhaps to Chasov Yar as well. So it looks as if the two pincer groups are now converging on each other. And let me repeat again, Bakhmut is by far the biggest battle that's been fought anywhere in Ukraine ever since the start of the hostilities on the 24th of February. It's been the longest, the toughest fought battle. It started in August, but what we can see is that there has been a marked acceleration in the tempo of the Russian advance since January. We see that both the northern pincer and the southern pincer have gained significant ground since early January. First, we had the capture of Soledar in mid-January. Then, as I said, we've had a string of settlements in the north, Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovyevka, now Berkhovka. Before long, the other settlement of Yagodnoye. All of these places have either been captured or are being captured. And on the other side, the southern front, we've seen Opitnoye and Klesheyevka both captured and with the Russians pushing on towards Ivanivka. And now it seems that, as I said, that particular group, that particular pincer has been reactivated and has gained greater force. So I sometimes read people say that this has been a very long, slow, grinding battle in Bakhmut. Yes, overall it has been, but do bear in mind that since January, the tempo of the fighting around Bakhmut has markedly intensified and will no doubt continue to do so. Well, there's been news from other battlefronts. There's been suggestions today, very difficult to verify, that the Russians have again pushed Ukrainian forces back in the Vuhledar direction. I absolutely can't confirm that. And there's also further reports that the Russians are now edging closer towards Liman in the northern front. This is in the area of northern Donbass, near Kharkiv region. And of course that they're also pushing down along the Oskol River line towards Kupiansk. Much less information coming from these places than there is from Bakhmut. In Bakhmut, definitely, we can see that the Russians are making accelerating progress, and they seem to be moving ever closer now to that position where they take not just the forces who are defending Bakhmut itself, but other Ukrainian forces that are adjacent to Bakhmut. They seem to be working towards an encirclement of all of these forces, or at least most of these forces, and that seems to be the trend of the fighting there. So that's what I'm going to say about the actual events on the battlefields. I'm going to make one quick observation about Western weapon systems. It seems that, Poland says that they've now delivered 4 Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. I think the Poles have done this because of all those reports that Ukraine was only going to get its tanks in March, and there's been some criticism about the fact that only a fraction of the tanks were being supplied. And anyway, the Poles wanted to be the first in, so they've now provided 4 Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. It's inconceivable that the Ukrainians have fully mastered the use of this tank, but there we are, the Poles have taken that step. In the meantime, though, Western leaders seem to be once again pulling back from whatever plan there might be to provide fighter jets to Ukraine. Jake Sullivan has said, that F-16s are not what Ukraine needs now. Ben Wallace in Britain says that Typhoon jets are things that Ukraine might have later, but it's not really what Ukraine needs. Also, it does look for the moment as if the idea of supplying Ukraine with fighter jets is once again off the table. And by contrast, the British government, Rishi Sunak, are now busy lobbying and talking about the supply of long-range missiles to Ukraine so as to strike Russian positions in their rear. It's not at all clear what missiles Rishi Sunak means. The British do have, as I've discussed before, cruise missiles, 500-kilometer cruise missiles, obviously less powerful and less sophisticated than the Russian ones. But they do have these Storm Shadow cruise missiles. It could be that they're talking about those, except, of course, as I've said already, that the British don't have that many of them. And it seems that the Ukrainian Air Force has now, to all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. And its fighter jets, anyway, aren't really adapted to launching these missiles. The MiG-29 fighter jets that Ukraine is left with aren't really adapted for use with these cruise missiles. No doubt they could be at the time, but it doesn't really seem like a very sensible idea. And there's also a lot of talk about Harpoon missiles, that these are long-range Harpoon missiles that Ukraine could use. Well, Ukraine has been supplied with Harpoon missiles before, and apparently the Russians located where they were in Odessa and pretty much destroyed the whole lot, and Ukraine at the moment doesn't have any Harpoon missiles. Well, I think this would be a complicated operation for all sorts of reasons, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, and I don't think the Harpoons are any sort of game changer. Perhaps what the British are trying to do is put pressure on the United States to supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. So far, the Pentagon has been strongly resisting that because ATACMS missiles are in short supply also. And even as I'm discussing this on this video, I've seen the latest Pentagon, latest US military package of support for Ukraine, $2 billion worth. And interestingly, it doesn't include ATACMS missiles. It talks about more HIMARS systems, more 155mm artillery shells, more drones. It's said to be costed for $2 billion. But importantly, it seems this entire package has to be manufactured before any of these systems can be delivered. And that, to my mind, provides further confirmation that the United States is now unwilling to supply more artillery or missiles, HIMARS missiles, to Ukraine, that its stocks have now become so depleted that it's not really in a position to do that. And very interestingly indeed, this summary of the assistance that's going to be provided to Ukraine from the arms manufacturers, it doesn't actually specify the quantity. It doesn't tell us how many shells, how many HIMARS missiles are going to be included in this package. There's quite a lot of reference to drones, and I noticed that the Switchblade drones that were being supplied earlier in the war, they're back. There's going to be another supply of 600 of them. They have proved completely ineffectual in this conflict up to this point, in contrast to the analogous Russian Lancet drone, which is like the Switchblade drone, a loitering munition that basically hovers over the air and then drops down and destroys Ukrainian vehicles and other locations and machines. Well, the Russian Lancet drone has been very effective. The Switchblade drone has not, presumably because the Switchblade drone is ineffective against the much more effective Russian air defenses. So anyway, we're back to that. We're back to the Switchblade drones. Presumably, Ukraine has run through its stock, and we're going to supply more, even though they didn't achieve very much. So it doesn't seem as if a lot of the supplies that Ukraine has been expecting to get are coming its way. And if the Pentagon is talking about manufacturing all of this equipment, then it does seem as if US stocks and NATO stocks now are running very low. Well, the other thing that's happened today is that the G7 has had a meeting. They're apparently going to announce more sanctions against Russia. The EU's attempt to come up with its 10th sanctions package, by the way, was a failure. I've seen brief accounts of what the sanctions are. They don't seem to me to add anything of substance to the sanctions that have been already announced even EU officials are in effect admitting that the West is out of sanctions. Its sanctions armory is as depleted, or exhausted if you prefer, as its armory of shells and missiles which it can send to Ukraine. Last but not least, we do have all kinds of meetings and discussions going on in the West about what to do. There's all sorts of plans and talks. I'm going to skip over those in this programme. It's quite clear to me that Western leaders are out of ideas. I think this is beginning to be understood, specifically in the United States itself, less so in Europe, and I suspect that at some point over the next few weeks and months, this debate, which should exist, will finally burst out into the open, though it will happen in the United States and not in Europe. Well, let's now turn to the country that does have plans and does have ideas, which is China. Now, there's been an awful lot of discussion over the last few days about a Chinese peace plan. At the Munich Security Conference, the Western powers were utterly spooked by the talk of a Chinese peace plan. And they were very worried that if this Chinese peace plan was announced over the next couple of days before the Western powers were able to put together a vote at the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, to condemn the Russian operation in Ukraine, that this would somehow spike that resolution and throw it off course. So the Western powers hurried and they got their resolution together. They cobbled it together. I haven't read the resolution, but everything I've heard about it is that it was incredibly watered down. It's basically reduced to calling on Russia to pull its troops out of Ukraine. The Russians said it had been severely watered down. Various countries that voted for it, such as Colombia, their representatives spoke about the fact that it had been watered down. But in the event, all that happened was that the vote reproduced itself. The countries that supported the resolution numbered 141, which is the same as have supported previous resolutions, much more critical, earlier resolutions, much more critical of Russia. But the same number of countries, 32, voted against and 32 abstained and 9 voted outright against. And importantly, China and India both were amongst the abstainers. So it doesn't seem to me as if the West has made any progress in the United Nations. Attempts, also as far as I can see, to promote actively President Zelensky's supposed 10-point peace plan, which isn't really a peace plan. It's a demand for Russia's surrender. Well, those don't seem to be going very far, and the Russians aren't interested. Most of the world doesn't seem to be very interested either. They got their resolution. They got it out before the Chinese unveiled what was expected to be their peace plan, but I don't think they've achieved anything much from it. And the fact that there is largely silence about this UN General Assembly resolution in the Western media today, at least the British media, to my mind, tells its own story. But anyway, the Chinese now have published their position paper. And I've got the full text before me, and it's relatively short, but I think too long to read on a programme like this. What I will say about it is that it is not a peace plan, not by any stretch of the imagination. It isn't even a roadmap for peace. What it is a statement of principles, a statement of principles by China about how they expect conflicts like the one in Ukraine to be settled, a kind of conceptual framework document, which is to some extent applied specifically to the situation in Ukraine. The extent to which this is the case can be seen by the first two paragraphs. So the first one begins respecting the sovereignty of all countries. It's a 12-point position paper. The first point reads, respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Notice that it's sovereignty that is emphasized. And it says, universally recognized international law, including the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, must be strictly observed. The sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries must be effectively upheld. Now, this is very interesting language because it doesn't speak about the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine specifically. It avoids mentioning Ukraine. It blandly refers to all countries. So, actually, that might just possibly slightly water down any suggestion of the territorial integrity of Ukraine being specifically protected. And the fact that this is all a retreat into generalities, well, you can see that with the next sentences. All countries, big or small, strong or weak, rich or poor, are equal members of the international community. That, of course, is something that the United States and the Western powers, well, they wouldn't dispute it openly, but privately they strongly disagree with that. After all, the United States talks about American exceptionalism, so putting the United States on equal level with, say, Vanuatu is not something that the United States would accept or acknowledge, but that's what the Chinese are saying. But the point here anyway is that this is a generical comment. All parties should jointly uphold the basic norms governing international relations and defend international fairness and justice. Equal and uniform application of international law should be promoted, while double standards must be rejected. So that's a paragraph that appears, it's the first paragraph, it appears to uphold Ukraine's territorial integrity, but it doesn't mention Ukraine, and it contains instead rather subtle, but nonetheless fairly pointed and obvious critiques of the United States and Western policies. And then it talks about the next one, paragraph 2, abandoning the Cold War mentality. The security of a country should not be pursued at the expense of others. Now, that's a Russian formulation. The Chinese are adopting it. The Russians are saying that by expanding NATO eastwards, the United States is prioritizing its own security and that of its other NATO member states over other countries which are excluded from NATO, notably Russia itself. And the Chinese agree. And they go on to say this, to make that point absolutely clear: the security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs. So NATO expansion is bad, and that should be abandoned by definition as part of any settlement of Ukraine. And it goes on to say the legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries must be taken seriously and addressed properly. There is no simple solution to a complex issue. So Ukraine is a complex issue, apparently, and there's no simple solution to it. All parties should, following the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security, and bearing in mind the long-term peace and stability of the world, help forge a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. So no more NATO. You should include the Russians in the security arrangements and in Europe. And basically that means going back to those two draft treaties that the Russians proposed back in December 2021 and which the Western powers rejected. And very interesting final sentence to this paragraph, because it goes on to say all parties should oppose the pursuit of one's own interest, security at the cost of other security, prevent bloc confrontation, and work together for peace and stability on the Eurasian continent. Now, note the word Eurasian continent, because, of course, we're no longer just talking about Europe. The Chinese are telling the Americans, the West, the Europeans, well, you're not actually a continent. Eurasia is the continent of which Europe is only a part. It's just a promontory of Eurasia. And guess which is the biggest, most powerful country in Eurasia? Of course, it's China. I say biggest, of course, in land area, Russia is bigger. But in terms of population, economic resources, and all those things, it is China. And that means that peace and stability must be extended not just to Europe itself, but right across Eurasian territory, perhaps even including the Indian subcontinent, and that what goes on in Europe is an integral part of this need to stabilize Eurasia as a whole. And that means that China is a country with an interest in all of these matters and has a right to be consulted and to become involved. It's again not something that, say, the British would be happy about. And then there's the next paragraph is all about ceasing hostilities, and it says that all parties must try and avoid fanning the flames, and there should be an attempt to achieve a cessation of hostilities, and that the Russians and the Ukrainians should be encouraged to resume direct dialogue as quickly as possible. And that is connected with the next paragraph, paragraph 4, which is about the fact that dialogue and negotiation are the only viable solution to the Ukraine crisis. So again, it talks about negotiations between Ukraine and Russia without the interference, in other words, of the Western powers. And then there's talk about a humanitarian crisis. Paragraph 5 is about dealing with all the problems of civilians and protecting civilians. And paragraph 6 is also about civilians and also about protecting and POWs. Then paragraph 7 is a particularly pointed one. It talks about keeping nuclear power plants safe. China opposes armed attacks against nuclear power plants or other peaceful nuclear facilities. Well, as we know, Russia has conducted no direct attacks on nuclear power plants. The only party to the conflict which has done that is Ukraine. They have shelled the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and China says quite straightforwardly that that is wrong and should not happen, and that reminds all parties that attacking nuclear power plants is contrary to international law, specifically the Convention on Nuclear Safety. And China supports the International Atomic Energy Agency in playing a constructive role in promoting the safety and security of peaceful nuclear facilities. And then paragraph 8 is about not using nuclear weapons. Paragraph 9 is about facilitating grain exports. Paragraph 10, particularly difficult for the Western powers, stopping unilateral sanctions, Unilateral sanctions and maximum pressure cannot solve the issue. They only create problems. And then the key paragraph, key sentence. China opposes unilateral sanctions not authorized by the UN Security Council. Relevant, in other words, China considers all of the unilateral sanctions that the United States and the EU, the Western powers, have imposed, not just over the course of the Ukrainian crisis against Russia, but all such sanctions, be they imposed against Russia or Iran or Cuba or Syria or, heaven help us, China itself. The Chinese consider all such sanctions, all such unilateral sanctions, to be illegal, contrary to international law, and that they should be stopped. They should be ended immediately. And they say that straightforwardly in the next sentence. Relevant countries should stop abusing unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction against other countries. And long-arm jurisdiction, of course, refers to secondary sanctions. And then there's talk about keeping industrial and supply chains stable. And the last is about promoting conflict, post-conflict construction. And earlier, in discussing the need to cease hostilities, the Chinese implicitly say that it's wrong to go on supplying weapon systems to either side, to the side in the conflict. But in fact, and perhaps rather interestingly, they don't say that expressly. They don't say that it's a mistake exactly to go on to continue to supply weapons to one side or another in the conflict, which might be taken by some people, possibly, just possibly, to open the way at some point for the Chinese to start supplying weapons to the Russians in the event that the US and the Western powers continue and perhaps escalate supplying weapons to Ukraine. So overall, a very interesting document. As I said, it is not, and I think this is I want to reiterate this again, it is not a peace plan. It's not a proposal or even a roadmap for peace, but it does set out Chinese position, and it does leave China with certain options if its ideas are disregarded. The Russians will be very happy, very content with this proposal, with this position paper. In fact, to be straightforward about it, I think they've almost certainly been consulted about it in advance. Now, we've also had from China a very comprehensive readout about the meeting between Wang Yi and Sergei Lavrov. We've not yet had, as of the time of making of this video, a readout of Wang Yi's discussions with President Putin. But it's an interesting readout. Again, it's very long. Chinese readouts tend to be very long. But it contains comments like this. Wang Yi noted that under the strategic guidance of President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin, the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for a New Era continues to operate at a high level. In the face of profound changes in the international landscape, China and Russia have always maintained strategic resolve, adhered to the general direction of building a multipolar world, advocated and practiced true multilateralism, opposed unilateral and bullying actions in any form. That's an interesting observation. The Russians oppose unilateral and bullying actions in any form, which would suggest that they're not bullying or engaging in unilateral actions against Ukraine, if you think about it. I mean, that's one way of reading these particular words. Perhaps that's going beyond what Wang Yi intended. But anyway, firmly safeguarded their respective sovereignty, security and development interests, actively explored and followed the development path in line with their national conditions, and constantly tapped the growth potential of cooperation in various fields. No matter how the international situation changes, China is willing to maintain a good development momentum of a new type of major country relations with Russia. And then directly below that, we have a photograph of Wang Yi and Lavrov shaking hands, smiling with each other, wearing, by the way, very similar suits. As somebody who takes an interest in these things, I think Wang Yi is possibly wearing a suit by Brioni, but anyway, just a guess. But anyway, the two of them, hand in hand, smiling together for the pictures, looking, as they no doubt are, the best of friends. And Wang Yi then goes on to say that the process of Chinese modernization will open up new prospects for all and further enrich its cooperation with other countries, including Russia. So China will continue to work together with Russia. They'll build up their economies together. And then we have the Chinese version of what Lavrov said. Lavrov noted that Russia attaches great importance to Russia-China relations and is ready to join hands with China to implement the important common understanding between the two heads of state and continuously consolidate and develop the Russia-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of coordination for a new era. And again, we have another photograph of Wang Yi and Lavrov smiling together and holding hands. So you could see that they are indeed joining hands with China. The Russians are indeed joining hands with China, and that's the photograph that the Chinese have attached to this readout. And the readout goes on to say that Russia hopes, this is Lavrov, the Chinese version of what Lavrov said, Russia hopes that the two sides will comprehensively restart exchanges in various fields and push for greater progress in pragmatic cooperation between the two countries. And then there's more about that. And then there's talk about how they're going to work together over at the United Nations and in other multilateral mechanisms. And then we have the one paragraph in this readout, right tacked on at the very end, which is about Ukraine. The two sides also had an in-depth discussion on the Ukraine issue. Wang Yi stressed that the more complicated the situation is, the more important it is not to give up peace efforts. He expressed the hope that all parties would overcome difficulties, continue to create conditions for dialogue and negotiations, and seek an effective way for a political settlement. And that's all. That's all that there is in this Chinese readout about Ukraine. The impression that's given is that Russia and China are continuing on their strategic course, deepening their friendship with each other. China has set out its position paper about how the conflict in Ukraine should be dealt with. I've discussed that at length. And I've said how the Chinese have left various options open to themselves, and the Russians, for their part, are willing to join the Chinese. And clearly they did have an in-depth discussion on the Ukrainian issue. But there's no hint in this Chinese readout of the Chinese trying to impose their ideas upon the Russians, and or making the Ukraine issue the centerpiece of China-Russia relations. And as I've said already, the Russians, for their part, are going to be very content with the Chinese position paper. So there we go. Chinese-Russian relations are still very strong, in fact, stronger than ever. And the Chinese coming up with a position paper which will leave the Russians contented, but which will be unacceptable to the Ukraine and to the West. And in fact, over the last few hours, Western political leaders, including the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, have dismissed it. Of course, they're not saying that they're dismissing it because they disagree with its contents or because they don't want China to be involved. They're saying, well, the problem is that China is too close to Russia to be in a position to propose a peace plan, even though, in fact, China isn't really proposing a peace plan. One wonders, by the way, whether the Western powers would apply that same logic to themselves. For example, if the United States were to propose a peace plan to the Russians, would Stoltenberg say that the Russians are within their rights to reject such a plan because the United States is too close to Ukraine? Well, it's a rhetorical question because, of course, we know that Stoltenberg would never say any such thing. But anyway, there we are. Now, the long and the short of all of this is that it's clear to me that the Chinese and the Russians are indeed going to forge ahead and they're going to develop and enhance their strategic partnership. The Ukraine conflict has probably accelerated the development of this relationship. I mean, they were already moving in that direction anyway, but it's certainly not caused them to come apart. They're coming ever closer together. There were all sorts of reports over the course of last year that the Chinese were annoyed with the Russians, that they were pulling away from the Russians, that they were distancing themselves from the Russians. We see that that is simply not the case. The Chinese position paper, on the contrary, tells us the opposite, as does this readout of Wang Yi's talks with Lavrov. I'm going to also say that up to this point, I've been very skeptical about the idea that the Chinese might be interested or might be involved in discussions about supplying weapons to the Russians. But having looked at this Chinese position paper, I'm starting to think that it could be the case that the Chinese might be thinking at some point of doing precisely that. I'm not saying that it's immediate, but let's go back to paragraph 3 about ceasing hostilities. Conflict and war benefit no one. All parties must stay rational and exercise restraint, avoiding fanning the flames and aggravating tensions, and prevent the crisis from deteriorating further or even spiraling out of control. All parties should support Russia and Ukraine in working in the same direction and resuming direct dialogue as quickly as possible so as to gradually de-escalate the situation and ultimately reach a comprehensive ceasefire. And then paragraph 4, resuming peace talks, dialogue and negotiation are the only viable solution to the Ukraine crisis. All efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis must be encouraged and supported. The international community should stay committed to the right approach of promoting talks for peace, help parties to the conflict open the door to a political settlement as soon as possible, and create conditions and platforms for the resumption of negotiation. China will continue to play a constructive role in this regard. Now, this doesn't seem to me to exclude the possibility of China providing weapons to Russia if the need or the call to do so arises. What weapons would those be? I'm going to suggest that they would most probably be drones. Now, there's been some reports in the US media about China supplying kamikaze drones to Russia. I don't believe that. I mean, why would the Russians need kamikaze drones from China when they've obtained such drones from Iran and have developed them in the form of the Lancet themselves? But Russia is short, or has been short, of long-range drones. They've developed drones like the Orion, which they could, in theory, deploy in Ukraine if they could produce it in sufficient quantities. Maybe in time they will produce it in sufficient quantities. It has apparently been very effective as it has been used, when it has been used. But the Russians are still at a very early stage in developing these long-range drones, and the Chinese, by contrast, have massive experience and knowledge of drone warfare. They're probably only behind the US in their knowledge and capability in this field. So I can well imagine that the Russians might be keen to tap into Chinese knowledge of drone warfare. And of course, the Russians could gain a lot from Chinese, or at least from long-range drones. It would become much easier for the Russians to conduct long-range, deep strikes on Ukrainian positions. If they had drones, the Ukrainian air defense system has been significantly weakened. Drones could probably operate pretty effectively deep behind Ukrainian lines. Analogous Western drones would probably find it difficult to operate behind Russian lines because of the capabilities of the Russian air defense system. So I can imagine that a supply of Chinese drones to Russia, or perhaps of Chinese help to the Russians in accelerating production of drones, these types of long-range drones, they could be a very useful addition, perhaps even a critical addition to the Russian armory in this war. Anyway, there we are. That's what I'm going to say about this Chinese plan. As I said, it's an interesting, very revealing position paper. It tells us a great deal about the direction of Chinese policy. And as I've said previously, it's clear that unlike the West, the Chinese do have ideas about how to take things forward, and they're implementing them. And their position paper is an interesting and suggestive document, even if it falls short of a peace plan or even a roadmap to a settlement of the conflict. My own personal view is that the Chinese, deep down, have come round to the same view as the Russians have, that the only way that this conflict in Ukraine is going to be resolved is through an outright Russian victory. And whilst the Chinese will only do a limited amount to make that happen, it's not impossible that at some point they might contribute to it. Anyway, that's me for the day. I hope you find this a useful video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Let me remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also find our you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also find amazing things in our shop: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.